I'm Megha, and like Jayashree mentioned, I work with Project Defy, and I'm today going to be spending the next 90 minutes with three very interesting perspectives on what changes are going to look like, what do they look like in the learning or education system as we know it. So we're going to spend the next 90 minutes in discussions. We're going to spend some time with questions that I will be posing to the panel. And after that, we will open it up to you as an audience. So while you're listening to us, while you're listening to the perspectives that they're sharing, feel free to put in your questions on the chat box. Yeah, this is Zoom, so let's try and keep our questions onto the chat box, which we will take towards the end of the panel. We'll give you about 20-25 minutes. So that's what the next 90 minutes will look like. What I'm going to do next is really invite our panelists one by one to introduce themselves. And before that, let me just spend about 2 minutes to give you a perspective on what is it that we're going to be talking about over the next 90 minutes. So over the last 1.5, 2 years, we saw the world change dynamically. What we also saw is our education, our conversations on learning, education, how young people are accessing education, how learning environments are trying to shift, really pace up. We saw a lot of people come together, institutes come together. We saw perspectives come together in terms of what is it that education is really trying to answer for. This became more pertinent with youth, young people who were at a loss of figuring out what the future would look like for them. With that as the context for this panel, we will set out to discuss, to find a way around what some of those changes can look like, what some of those learning environment shifts can look like, how can we empower the community to be able to come together and learn together. And those are some of the discussions that we'll be doing today. To start off, to kick off, I am going to take this moment to invite Manish to unmute himself, to introduce himself, and also give us some context of what is the work that you do, what is it that you've been doing over the years in the space of education learning environments. Manish, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be amazing.
Hi, Megha. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste to everyone. So good to be here this morning with you. So my name is Manish Jain. I'm based in Udaipur. Been here for the last 24 years. I'm part of Shikshantar and Swaraj University and the Jail University and many other projects. Basically, my journey started when I was, 12 years old. I started questioning the education system and questioning it in terms of why it, privileges exams and paper over three-dimensional, what I call two-dimensional, why it privileges two-dimensional learning over three-dimensional learning. So exams and paper rather than real-world experiences. And I would always be scolded because I like to do so-called extracurricular things. And I found that those things were the real things that were giving me joy and making a difference in the world. And so I started questioning then, and I also started questioning this whole system of labeling children, innocent children. So I often, my journey has led me to believe that modern factory schooling is one of the worst crimes against humanity. And I've seen millions and millions of innocent children who are talented, bright, creative beings being labeled as failures, as slow learners, as dropouts, and all kinds of negative labeling that's done to them, which I think is really damaging. I've also seen how education has, over the years, really killed creativity and deep connections and relationships between people. So I think, this has led me on a journey where I started questioning, wanting to change the system. I was part of I was part of many projects at Harvard for this. I was part of UNESCO, and I realized a couple of things there is that one is there's a fundamental design flaw in the modern education system, and it starts with how we understand human beings. So the whole design of the modern factory school is based on the army system, on the prison system, and on the factory system. And that design flaw, despite all of the recommendations over the past 75 years to change education, that design flaw is not being corrected. So we just keep trying to add on more to the same fundamentally misdesigned system. And the second thing I realized after being at working with UNESCO and UNICEF and governments all over the world is there's no real inner desire to want to change this system. It is very much aligned with trying to convert us into economic slaves, which serves, our government calls it Ministry of Human Resources Development. So it's very clear what the agenda is, and it serves the narrative of stupid consumerism and growth very well, as it creates much more insecurity, inferiority, scarcity, competition within human beings. So I realized that there's not a desire to change it. And the third thing I realized is the most important thing we have to do is unlearning. So most of the things we've been schooled into and conditioned into a schooled mindset, and unless we fundamentally unlearn many of those things. So my last 25 years really has been a journey of unlearning a lot of fear and anxiety, unlearning a sense of superiority, and and my guru for that has been my illiterate village grandmother. So my wife and I say we studied at our village, at our grandmother's university, and she has helped us very deeply in this unlearning journey. And the other person who's helped me, I have a 19-year-old daughter. She has never gone to school. She is one of the most wise and creative people I know, and sensitive. So she has also been a guru for me in my unlearning journey. So the last thing I just want to say is that I think we are facing an incredible crisis in education. Unfortunately, most people are not aware of that. If I usually share it by drawing a triangle. The triangle has 3 points. One is, and these are all crises that have been created by the factory schooling system. So we have one crisis is a crisis of the unemployment, where the government itself is saying in the next 20 years there'll be 18 crore unemployed educated youth in our country, which I think is a conservative estimate. I think it'll be much more. And so we have a system that is manufacturing unemployment and creates a lot of, again, people who want jobs, but there's not more than the entire economy is 6% formal sector jobs. So we have this crisis. The second crisis is the mental health crisis. So this system is, again, what it's producing is people who are depressed, suicidal, insecure, filled with massive, and this has become a new racket, mental health, because it's producing that, and then it's selling people another fake solution on top of it. So we need to ask the questions of getting to the roots. And the third is what was, Akash has previously spoken on, is the ecological crisis. So much of the ecological crisis can be linked to the modern education system. And so I think the invitation is that this is a fundamental chance to rethink. Unfortunately, I do think that, I was saying the mental health crisis, being online and forcing kids online is going to only create a much more horrible kind of, it's a genocide to children's senses, creativities, and many more things. And so I think we need to really raise some much more fundamental questions. So good to be here with everyone today. And we have been, over the last 25 years, creating lots of new models based on the fundamental idea of self-designed learning, where we need to shift from a learner-centered model to a learner-led model. So I look forward to discussing that with everyone today.
Thanks so much, Manish, for that. I think your take on the education system and what it needs as an overall is probably what will form a lot of questions that are coming up, and also where we find the intersection. I will at this point invite Rishi to please introduce yourself and the work that you've been doing in this sector.
Yeah, hi, Megha, thank you. And hello, everyone. Manish and Shashank, my co-panelists today, and everyone else present. My full name is Rishikesh. I don't have a surname. We in South India go with initials. And this is always, put me into a spot of bother because people insist on surnames. Now, it again, brings us to this point as to how we want to standardize things. Without surname, they don't want to recognize you. And in fact, in some contexts within our country, they want surnames because they want to get into your background. And, I experienced this very early in my career when I used to go to the villages wherein they couldn't believe that I didn't have a surname and they felt I was hiding it. It's only later on when I understood more that I understood the reason behind why they wanted a surname. So anyway, more about that later. My name hence is Rishikesh only. I go with initials B and S, my native place and my father's name. I've been with Azim Premji Foundation for a decade and a half. And since we began the university, I've been teaching at the university. So that's my professional background currently. I come from a history background. So for many of the questions that were being posed and what Akash was presenting to us, my quest is really as to where did it all start? Why did it start? And I couldn't agree more with what Manish just shared with us. So my quest has been particularly once I started working with the public education system as to how did we come to this, right? And in fact, one of the things that I do in the university is teach a course called Comparative History of Education, wherein we go back to identify the origins of this absolutely ridiculous factory model that we have today. And interesting that you don't really have to go too far back. Just a couple of centuries ago that this model got established in Europe to the demands of the society then. So, in the 18th century, with industrialization taking place in Europe, large number of families coming into the cities, they established this. So hence pretty much like the industries that were getting established. And of course, there was also a time when nation states were getting built. So it was in some sense also to strengthen the idea of a nation state. And particularly when the nation was heterogeneous, you had to really put this idea into the minds of the people, and no better than to put it into the minds of young children who would then go on to carry this idea and strengthen it. So now that's something that we've gone on with for nearly 300 years and continue to kind of tinker with it rather than really sit back or rather step back and ask this question as to what is it doing? What is it doing to our individual children? What is it doing to the society that they then come on to contribute to? And what is it doing overall to our planet? Right? And all these questions that that Akash was putting out and what Manish was asking, I think there is very clear answers in terms of how this is really not the road to walk further on. But then, the solutions for it is not easy again. Of course, people experienced and trying out models out there who come out with, many models that probably could replace this. But it's not as easy when one is talking about the size that we have in our country in terms of the population, the children's population, and everything else, the diversity. So, so for me, the quest again has been as to what is the best suited solution. And I'm not really on the radical path there in terms of solution, because I think that one will have to really think through as to what is it that is going to benefit everyone. Though, of course, nothing of that sort is happening in the current factory system. But then if we are going to replace it with something then it will have to benefit everyone, and it will also have to help them navigate the world, because the world is not going to change just if we change the education system immediately. So the changing of the world is going to take some time. And so they will have to navigate that present world that they are going to get into, as well as think and work towards creating that better world. So, so this is where I feel a completely radical solution, will not work, and it would probably put our children into more trouble than otherwise they would be with even the factory system. So this is really where I currently work on. And so policy interests me a lot. In recent times, earlier education and what is it that we need to do there? What is it, more importantly, that we need to stop doing there at the early years? Now, these are the things that really interest me. And thanks once again, everyone. Look forward to a lovely discussion.
Thanks so much, Rishi. I think you touched upon something very interesting, which is the whole scope of policy, right? It seems like we live in a world where we think a changed policy or a new law or a legislation is going to fix things. But where do we stand? And I think we're going to touch upon that as we get more into discussions further on. Thanks for being here with us so much for that. Shashank, I'm going to move to you, and I think you are actually one of the panelists today with us who comes from the background of New Age, right? So the intersection and the marriage of technology, right, and taking it to communities. So please go ahead, introduce yourself, and tell us a little more about the scope of interventions that you're doing in the system.
Thank you, Megha. I think it's a great honor to be here amongst Manish ji and Rishi ji. So my name is Shashank. As I said, I think I co-founded, being from a technology background, I co-founded Convergence as an edtech social enterprise that will, partner with state governments, that will partner with civil society organizations to bridge learning gaps for the bottom of the pyramid children. And in our last 8 years of journey, we have been able to anchor some edtech experiments in multiple environments, both in school. We have enabled models that are synchronous, asynchronous, offline, online, physical, digital, self-learning, assisted learning. So I think with respect to the scope of edtech and how edtech can, facilitate better teaching learning experiences, I think we have been a part of some interesting things happening in the country. And in this discussion today, I look forward to discussing the radical change in our esteemed panelists and the people connected with us. Thank you, Megha.
Thanks so much, Shashank, for introducing yourself. I think, you mentioned that you're one of probably the youngest panelists here, especially the scope of work. But I also think that the conversation on itself is so relatively young, right? Technology as the delivery mechanism is also so relatively new, especially for the marginalized community. So I think we're looking forward to some of those discussions. So I'm going to now, after this round of introduction, jump right in to some questions that I'll pose to all of you. And, I wanted to, we talk about this. We talk about the factory model. This has become synchronous with how we look at the system today, right? So starting there, and we talk about, especially in the context of India, where did this system really come from, right? There are conversations around its post-colonial system that was handed to us. There are conversations, and this was meant for the market forces. With all of that, Rishi, if you could lay the context in terms of, I know it's a huge topic, but what exactly is the historical narrative and the history of the system as we know it today here in India? Where does it really emerge from? A quick summary of that, so the audience also is on the same page about what do we say when we say the historical system that exists today.
Yeah, I think, again, the history is really not very long. It's just since the British came over that, we slowly got into the system, which then got cemented. And we never bothered to, think about alternatives. And when alternatives were given, we also just, dismissed them. Nai Taaleem, for instance, was Gandhi's alternative. Shantiniketan was Tagore's alternative. Now, where are they today, right? And they remain probably single schools here and there, but then never thought about thinking of these alternatives seriously and revising these models, refining them to actually suit our country. But we just completely ignored, and they unfortunately today have not grown. Models have to grow as well, right? And that's when they will continue to meet the demands that the society has. And so it's very unfortunate that we stuck on to the British model, which, as we all know, replaced what was already there in our country. And if you listen to Gandhi, he's very angry, and he in fact also talks about how the British came, they examined our education system, scratched the roots, and just left the beautiful tree dying, and implanted their system, which had no value for us. And it had only value for them, and it served their purpose of building their empire, but had no value for us. It had no value to help build our society, help our society progress. So it was a transition that happened over the 200 years of the British rule. It was not just that immediately they came up with an idea of the factory model. It was slow. The transition was slow. There were already the madrasas, the maktabs, the pathshalas, which were operating very differently. As we'll probably not have time to get into the details there, but they were different. They were not as standardized as we had from the British, the model that we got from the British. There were still, even though by the time that the British come, the maktab, madrasas, or the pathshalas were not serving our purpose completely. The knowledge generation, the way it had happened earlier, was not the way it was taking place. So there was that, that again, let's say, regression that was taking place. But at the same time, what the British gave us was replacement, which had absolutely no value in terms of helping our society progress. Right? It had a huge value for them. I mean, they wanted literates and people who had the basic literacy and numeracy to help staff their various institutions, and it did serve that purpose. The bigger question is as to why did we continue with that, right? With our constitution 75 years ago, 70 years ago, talking about a society which would be just, equitable, and which would pride in its own history and culture. Now you get stuck to means through which you want to go to that society, which is completely redundant and is in fact not going to serve your purpose at all. So it is quite astonishing that people have not raised their voices, and because of which, obviously, the people's representatives have been happy at not really doing anything about it. In fact, a very short, I think it's a very useful thing to look at as to also what happened to Nai Talim. In the initial years, you did have some support from the central government to the idea of Nai Talim. And there was also an institution that was set up. There was some funding that is coming in, but then there was almost a systematic killing of this alternative, so that we just have this factory model in place across. And then, of course, as we come into the 90s and 2000, it was about just ensuring the standardization takes place, even in the nooks and corners of a country where there was still some surviving institutions from the indigenous thinking, right? So the tribal communities had their own indigenous system of education, and all that was completely removed and was transplanted with this factory model, which also shows us, or has led us to, this very dire poverty of the mind, right? Because what it did is, if there was a system which was helping certain knowledge being carried on, being worked on, being refined, now you went in with a completely something completely unfamiliar and put in there, and tried getting the children to come on to this platform, which basically completely crushed them. And so these children, and when we look at the data today and we look at the number of children from our tribal communities dropping out of school, they are in millions, right? So that's the tragedy that has happened. And so that's a very brief history. Well, if there is just there is just no one person to blame, or just one institution to blame, one time period to blame. We can't just keep saying that the British gave it to us and here we are, right? Or Macaulay did this to us. We're all there to take that blame because none of us have questioned strongly enough to enable that shift that is so important to happen.
Yeah. No, thanks, Rishi, for sharing that. I think, it kind of is that, right? We talk about what was given to us and then why did we not move out of it? There's something interesting you said, which was, alternatives, right? So systems that existed before we were handed over a new system started being called the alternatives, right? Whether it was the Pathshala system, whether they were the other systems, they started being the systems that you could or could not go to, but the regular school system that we got passed on was going to be the system, standardized system where you could learn, right? And that for me is interesting because that connects me to the next question that I have for Manish here. Manish, we speak about standardization, right? There was this focus. India got independent. There was a zeal to become modern, to move towards the modern world. And somewhere it seemed like that the school system that the Britishers had created seemed to be that process, seemed to be that vehicle to reach our modern expectations of a modern India, right? And therefore, standardization began. Now, today, where we stand, today, where we are, where do you think the overhaul, if it has to be, it can be? So while systems are called alternatives, and we're looking at really questioning, can alternatives answer the modern day questions of jobs, of employment? What is it? What are the most obvious things that can be overhauled and can be completely changed over?
So I would just add, thanks. That's a great question. I think Rishikesh has put a very nice institutional narrative. I have a very different subaltern narrative about actually what the systems were, and it starts from I just would like to supplement to what Rishikesh was saying before I answer your question, Megha, if that's okay. So I think one is that education system first colonized the British themselves. It was used as a tool for destroying their own indigenous local economies, their own skills. Diverse artisans got destroyed in this process in England itself, and it was used to kind of centralize and build an army that could colonize the rest of the world. And one of the areas where they've suffered more than we have, the Europeans and Americans, is in language diversity. This system actually destroyed their own indigenous language diversity initially, and was used to centralize all of that. That's well documented. So I think that, the colonization, they actually became instruments of it, but they were first victims of it. And I think that's important to notice that, and they are today, I would say, suffering far, far worse from this system than we have been suffering, because many of our much of our diversity still exists despite all of the efforts to colonize it and destroy it. There's still amazing people, artisans, languages, communities which are not dependent on this centralized system. And the second thing I would say, that Rishi's narrative forgets that almost every single policy, since he's a policy person, I have to remind him, every single national policy has critiqued this education system. It's not that it's been ignored by people, but it's actually been very clearly stated that the system needs to be overhauled. And many, going back to the 60s even, these critiques started coming out even in policy documents. So there's been a very strong effort to kind of put it on paper, but there's no serious understanding first of the system itself and its dynamics. So, I can say I want to jump from here to Sri Lanka, but that means I don't understand gravity, for example. So we need to understand how systems work, which has been kind of missing in the whole game of reform. And that leads to me to say that there's been no real desire to reform the system, because the power dynamics that drive the system are still those same power dynamics that were part of when the British were there. So we need to look further, that it's not a matter of just playing in the policy circles, because those policy circles are already highly, highly corrupted. And, anyone who fools themselves, I spent a few years when I was much younger thinking I could change the policy circles, but that was before I understood what the game was. And Gandhiji himself had said, his first recommendation was close the education systems, all these British schools, for 3 years, and let us reimagine. So there's been no real effort to do that, and reimagine not from, again, starting with the frameworks that we inherited from the West, but actually reimagining based on our own inherent. This is the problem also with policymakers, as they don't understand our inherent grassroots knowledge systems, skills, potentials, what I call, many streams. We need to get out of this death monoculture of the mainstream and start to understand the many streams that still flourish. And I think that even, all of the examples, Rishikesh, were still institutional examples. But there was the informal is what has shaped the real India for thousands of years and continues to drive it. Informal relationships, cultures, economies, whatnot. And so until we have a understanding of those things in a deeper sense, there's no way we are going to get out of the mess that we're in. And it's going to be, it's very eager to sit in universities and say, no, it's not possible. But those children, I encounter them every day, who have been labeled, who are being abused and maligned and humiliated by the education system. And I think we cannot just pretend to say that we're going to, fix it like that, because the system, I just had a discussion with somebody who came and said, no, I work in Busties and we need schools there because, those poor kids need a safe space. I'm like, the system, economic system, is making those spaces unsafe. They're stealing the real wealth out of communities. So let us stop, pretending to be playing the white man's burden that we're there to help them. The system is actually designed to steal wealth and centralize it from communities, whether they be rural communities or urban Busties. So let us understand that. And also, I would just ask a question to Shashank here that, you're bridging the things, but what about all those millions of unemployed youth you're going to create? Because the things that the government's curriculum is providing, even if they pass it, those kids, we have already millions of unemployed B.Ed, M.Ed, even engineers sitting in front of us. So I don't understand how bridging that system by getting more rural kids and giving them this false promise, you study and you're going to get a job. This is no longer, this is anyone who says that today is a blatant liar, that you're going to study and get a job, So let's call out these lies and let's be honest here if we're going to have a conversation today.
So I think, Manish, you have really laid down what I think is already being discussed, at least in the space of what we're calling alternatives. I'm seeing a lot of comments also come on the chat, which are really trying to make peace with or bridging this gap of what we know as standardized system and what it promises, the allure of those promises, and what is happening. Shashank, to you, I would actually ask that the new narrative that was again imposed on the already existing conversation on education was that technology somehow would bridge that gap, right? So while the policy frameworks, while the discussions, the discourse was slowly shifting towards does the system even work, we brought in another perspective to it, which is that if you bring in tech, at least access would come in, right? For some reason, it seemed like access would be. Now, what we're looking at is today, especially what the pandemic showed us was that suddenly there was a huge shift towards let's put everybody on a digital platform, right? Let's do that. Let's bridging the gap is what became the narrative of it. So where do you really see technology coming in and playing a role, not just from the lens of delivery of a curricula and all that? I do have some questions on curricula later on, but really on the connect, right? And what are you seeing? What are you seeing on the ground? Where are you really seeing this go?
Yeah, Megha. So I think today's education system obviously is highly susceptible to unprecedented conditions. No wonder I think education was the most affected sectors since the pandemic. But I think what EdTech can do, and I think is basically neutralize the disparity that exists. If you can create that access at the last mile, and this is the most obvious thing that we see every day, right? I mean, the privilege, is the most obvious indicator there. Students studying in the same geography, same class, same age, they have different learning experiences because of their economic backgrounds. And I think and these students tackle poor infrastructure, irregular pedagogy, and I think access can definitely bridge some of those things. And I think another thing that I see changing, especially is the whole role of assessments in school education, particularly. Where assessments were previously seen as a end goal of to the year worth of rote learning. But I think now with the kind of work that some of the organizations are putting together, assessments are now becoming a tool to understand the learning capabilities of students. And once you use that as an indicator of learning, it can be used to drive a lot of good things in education and facilitate a lot of nudges which students need from time to time. And I think lastly, I think on the curriculum side, I think you will discuss that later probably, but I think today's education clearly does not teach a child on how do they prepare themselves for the real world, right? And I observe this every day. Students who graduate from school, and Manishji was also pointing on this fact, bridging learning gaps, is not the end solution. There has to be a learning continuum from school to, employment. And I see a lot of students, going through a massive identity crisis after they finish their schooling. And we also did a survey once where half of the students, told us that learning in school is actually not helpful in whatever the job that they're doing today. So there's a lot that we all need to do collectively, but there's some progress at least that we are seeing in terms of EdTech facilitating access, EdTech facilitating engagement at the last mile, and also the role of assessments in terms of driving better learning outcomes for our children.
Awesome.
Can I add one thing, Megha?
Yeah, sure.
Just adding on to this, I think that there's two areas that we have to really look at if we're serious about really reimagining education. So one is the whole monopoly of the diploma system, degrees and diplomas. And actually, what was it, 1968, I guess, Ram Murthy Commission report from that time, they had recommended something really amazing. They said diplomas and degrees should be delinked from jobs, government jobs. They said that was one of their most important recommendations. Nobody listened. We listened. We started a campaign in Swaraj University called Healing Ourselves from the Diploma Disease. And, we're talking about social hierarchy. The worst new form of the caste system is the diploma system. And where people sitting in universities think that they have entitlement and rights to everything, and those without degrees are made invisible in our country and denied so many basic rights and privileges. So this campaign, we have more than right now 1,500 organizations, companies, NGOs who are willing to remove the requirement from diplomas and degrees from their hiring and promotion processes. And they have agreed that if young people come with a portfolio of real experiences, not this fake online things, not this fake examination marks, but real experiences of life where they've done projects, they've engaged with society and communities. They've taken like real experiments. They will give them opportunities. So that is one thing. And I think if we collectively can bring that to, 50,000 organizations, it'll shake the entire country. The other thing is, anyways, and this will create real, if I hear both of the other panelists really concerned about disparity, but the game is, if you really look the last 50 years, despite all of the efforts, the disparity has increased phenomenally. The gap between the rich and the poor has increased phenomenally. So let's not fool ourselves that this current system, and 1% or less than 1% people are going to get into universities despite all of our efforts. The number of jobs, everyone agrees, is decreasing because of AI coming. So let's see that. How do we actually look at the reality? I think what schooling has done, the biggest damage is that we avoid reality. We create this fake bubbles in our mind and on paper, two-dimensional, and we keep playing around that. But the reality of on the ground is what I think I would invite people into, and that the reality that the system, is a monopoly system. So I think unless we really look at the degree system and dismantling that degree system, which is anyways happening, whether we like it or not, it's going to happen in the next 10 years, because you have all kinds of new mechanisms coming up, which are much more relevant and appropriate for companies to find people who can work with them. And also, I think the exam, as Shashank was saying, the examination system, which is only privileging a certain kind of learning. And unless, you can do multiple things, but ultimately this high stakes examination, which is privileging certain things, unless we're serious, this is what I call the Queen's jewels. Unless you are really going to seriously dismantle that, all of it is fake. All of it is just hot air you're talking, because all of those other ways, that what Gandhiji talked about, head, heart, hands, and home, we are only assessing a tiny percent of the head. All of the other ways that we learn and make sense of our lives and the world are not being at all valued. And so unless you create a proper mechanism which is going to value different forms of learning, we're always going to just privilege something at an expense of losing a lot more.
Yeah, I think that connects me to what I was going to ask from a policy standpoint, right? So, Rishikesh, there is acknowledgement in the last decade or so, and there is huge acknowledgement that the unemployment has risen. There is also acknowledgement that students that are graduating, so-called graduates, are not fitting. They still stay unemployed, and that leads rise to frustration. And yet, it seems like even if you read the latest NEP, right, there is a huge denial in terms of some of these acknowledgements, right? So the NEP still focuses on, in nice flowery language, of course, that hey, let's give students a lot more options. Let them mix and match study sectors. Let them pick up what they think is vocational, what they think is that. So while there are reports and reports and reports that also come out from government circles, the policy at some level still seems to be in denial. It still seems to want to keep on still running the system as we know it, right? In the NEP, for example, we still don't see acknowledgement or at least bringing in the alternative systems that are working in the country, right? So major part of the countries are experimenting with the system, right? It's still not bringing back acknowledgement to the traditional systems that are still going on in tribal areas and all of that. So where is that? Where is that going to go at all? Because we will always go back to this question, right? That if young people go through alternatives, then who will take them in the market? Because there seems to be a huge policy disconnect there, right? So why is that happening? And where do you think that will change in the coming times? Or do we think that the system is just too corrupt to not lead there?
Well, Megha, see, I think Manish also referred to it, that the policy has made the right noises, right? I mean, from the 66 Kothari Commission onwards, I mean, 50 years ago is when in our country, serious thinking on school education began at the policy level, right? At the committees which were set up by the governments. So you do see in the policies all the way, up to the national education policy, and the one before this, wherein we were discussing about the curricular frameworks, which is NCF 2005. You will see that there are all the right kinds of noises made, but then nothing gets translated in terms of what needs to happen at the ground level. Now that disconnect is, of course, there is always this particular aspect of policy paralysis happening for various reasons. But one of the things that I notice in the policies is that the plan of action that needs to come along with the policy, it gets disconnected right there. Either you don't even have a good plan of action, or the plan of action itself is very idealistic, not taking into account the context that one needs to begin with. You may want to move towards that ideal kind, but then you can't speak about that in the policy and then put out a plan of action wherein it's just hop, skip and jump out there. So the policy needs to in fact detail out, and that is very important, because you have the best of minds hopefully thinking through all this and coming out with a policy which is very progressive. But then how do you get there? You can't just leave it to another team or another set of people. These people will have to lay that down, and then of course there are going to be consultations, deliberations in terms of what is the best way, what is the tinkering that is required, right? So that's something that I have not seen in the policies, in the National Education Policy 2020. And when I say NEP 2020, I am referring to the more details that you get in the draft NEP. You do see that detailing, and that is the reason why it is amongst the amongst one of those very pragmatic policies, because though the vision is talking about these ideal situations, the vision is talking about this unknown world that our children today getting into school would be going to, right, 20 years later, and hence what is it that we need to do, and hence how is it that we need to go about. And that's the reason the focus, so much a focus on the early years, right? I mean, if we are still going to continue, particularly at the early years, a factory-based model wherein you're going to get your children sit on benches, put their lips on the, put their fingers on the lips and listen to the teacher. I mean, God save these children, right? 20 years later, all the problems that they're going to be facing, which we don't even know what kind they would be, they are not going to be able to handle that. And so the policy, the NEP 2020 does hence emphasize on what needs to happen for not just the first 3 years, 5 years, but 8 years, right? So all the way until a child is 8 to 9 years, there is a certain kind of pedagogic approach that is expected to be in place. Now, again, that's the reason why it doesn't talk about like RTE, classrooms with 4 walls, but says that the focus really has to be on the curriculum and the pedagogy. Do it wherever you want to, but then the kind of pedagogy which is based on discovery, which is experiential knowledge. Now these are the things that are very, very crucial for those young minds, right? And in recent decades we've had so much of research on neurosciences which has shown everyone as to how is it that young human brains develop, and also the fact that a large part of those connections get done by the time a human being is 8 or 9 years. So the policy is taking into account all that and saying that that is really what we need to change, and change it now, right? Because it's something that they're going to then benefit 20 years later when one goes to, either as Manish was saying, you don't really require degrees, but then you require those capacities, right? Your brain should have acquired those capabilities that 20 years later, when you are out there in the world, you're able to either figure out as to what is it that you want to do, what is it that would enable the society, what is it that there is a demand in the society for, which you would be able to give to the society. So that is the way the individuals can sustain themselves. But then to lay that foundation, and after that, of course, you need to build on that foundation till at least you finish school, till 12th. Right? Post that, yes, it could be anything, and higher education should be for knowledge generation, so that later on that gets used to further move the society ahead, and not, I completely agree with Manish that it shouldn't be for that job, right? The job is you do schooling for 15 years, age 3 to age 18, finish your 12th, have everything, that you could acquire yourself with, and then you should be ready for the world. You're an adult, you're past 18. If you think that you want to contribute to knowledge generation, get into higher education, right? But not higher education, not for a certificate to get a job. And nobody is going to be waiting for a job, as we all know which way we are headed, right?
Sure. No, thanks for sharing that, Rishi. I'm going to connect this to and take a question for Shashank here. Shashank, one of the things that we're talking a lot about these days is this young adults, right, and young children, right, and also where is it that we are driving them towards, right? Whether and I'm talking in the context of the system as you and I know it currently, right? And technology as an intervention now seems to be the next big paradigm shift, which says that this is what will take this young generation to the future. So with technology now playing a role, where is the learner? What is the learning centered around? And who is it really being centered around? And is there therefore a need to revisit the way we are looking at tech interventions also? And if you can, just give us some examples of that this whole shift, right? Not just the work you're doing, but if you look at ed tech per se, right? So the question really is that, because you see that reflected also within a policy framework, right? There is a shift towards smart classes. There was this whole movement of smart classes. Then came tinkering labs. Then came, then the next paradigm happens. And all of this is being laid off on the fact that we think technology is going to change the game. So tell me, what is technology really centering on? Who is it centering on? And very honestly, what is the honest opinion there? What is it really working for?
Yeah, I think we were all discussing, right, the role of changing our models to kind of from learning centered to learning led. I think that is what technology can definitely facilitate. I mean, there was a famous saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Right. So because for holistic development to happen, for children to know about more creative career options, right, everybody has to play a part, whosoever is around the child, and technology can bring that world closer to the child, right? Technology. So today, for example, anybody who wants to know about something, they have Google, YouTube to go to. So I think the YouTube teacher can be as inspiring as the school teacher for a learner today, right? The YouTube teacher is also now a part of that village, basically, that we keep talking about, right? So they can, so that is one perspective, but still it's in the very nascent stages. Nobody today is really able to, predict the gap between demand and supply, right? And as Manishji also said, I mean, we're just producing millions and millions of children who are incompetent, right? If somebody can, and we have actually done that exercise ourselves, where we tried to predict the demand supply gap using some of the data that the labor ministry had, and we were unsuccessful because that was historical data. What is about to come in the future, nobody knows. But I think if we can really, at least even half-heartedly, I mean, make that attempt, right, of predicting what the future could be like, we can try to bring the world closer to the child using technology.
So I'm going to, now bring a thread to this. So Shashank, you mentioned about it takes a village to grow a child. And now the different parts in that village now we're talking about seems like are tech on one side, human intervention on one side, the child at the center of it on one side. So my next question to actually all three of you would then be that what is this going to be? What is this village going to look like? Are we in a position today to say, do we have it in us to say today that let's reimagine this village itself, away from the assumptions that we make on demand supply, on labor, on market forces, on what the markets need? And I connect this especially, for the audience, where we might have, I don't know if you have young learners on it here, but definitely parents who probably have children who are also probably anxious with this whole shift from school to university to workplace. I know for a fact that my dad was, So what is this reimagination? Can you tell me today on this panel, what would the radical reimagination look like of the different components of this village that will grow up, that will help a young person to grow up? And I'll give you all three 1 minute. And I mean, give me like your most radical reimagination of this village, from the perspective you come from, because that I really want to hear about. So let's start with Rishikesh first to go with, because we wrapped up with Shashank. But what will this radical reimagination of a village look like? What will those village have?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I was hoping to go last, but anyways, see, let's put aside everything, right?
Yeah.
It's just about what is it that children want to do, and how is it that they're going to lead their own learning. That's really how one needs to think about. Yeah. You need other children for that. See, that's the concept of school, right? It's about bringing together children, right? We've added in so many other things and built it in a very structured manner that it's just become completely inflexible. But then it's about bringing children together so that collaboratively, through discoveries, through the natural curiosity, that they go on learning. And then there is an adult who's facilitating that learning. That's the teacher. The teacher's role is to do that facilitation, right? So in that sense, it's not really radical. It is going back to that natural way of learning. And that's really what we ought to get into doing, right? And this you do, and over a period of time, bring in a little structure. There are certain concepts that are useful, and you bring all that. And after 15 years of such education, a child who's attended school, I mean, this is really my, if you want to call it radical stand, a child who's attended school regularly for 15 years, or who's been part of this learning process, even if you don't want to use the school, should be given the school leaving certificate. If that certificate is of any value, that I finished school. Why do we need any assessments? Because every living being is a natural learner. 15 years regularly I attend, an adult facilitating my learning, my peers there with whom I'm collaborating. At the end of 15 years, give me the school leaving certificate. I'm going to use that and go ahead and do something in the society, right? That's been my argument now when board exams were shut. Instead of thinking of all sorts of permutations and combinations to pass children, very ridiculous, right? So yeah, and post that, higher education, I mean, we need to understand I think that's the biggest de-link that needs to happen, that this continuity that we have, school and then higher education and the job, school, and that's the end of it. You have your foundation in place. Then you want to go work, you want to go experiment, you want to go travel, right? Whatever. And higher education, well, there is something that you want to dig deep into. You think that there is something new that can come out. That's where you go into higher education. Right. So dealing that, and then post that, of course, if there is a job that is attractive, go in there and want to do it, well, go there. Otherwise, you want to find out something, you want to contribute to the society in your own way, that's what you should be equipped with to do. Right. The society, of course, the societal other frameworks need to come into play. So for instance, if I want to do something, start something, I may need some capital. Now, it should be the role of the government, the society, to be able to provide that capital for these young, bright minds, right? Those kinds of roles are the ones that the institution should be playing. And that's really how we move ahead as a society. I think I've taken more than a minute. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. That's totally fine. No, I think that's interesting. I think there is an interesting perspective to saying that, this distinction between young people needing facilitation-led learning, and then at the higher education level, they can make a choice for somehow that after 18 have the capacity to make a choice, whereas between the age of 6 to 18, they need a facilitator-led learning. I think that I think somehow forms the foundation of also the policy shift, and we're seeing that happen in the policy. Shashank, to you, when I say reimagine the village, for me, that will help a learner grow. I do definitely want you to lay down the perspective of this tech for me, for sure, because one of the best arguments I hear when we say why are we even looking at tech as a module is that, hey, the world has already adopted it. So what is going to happen when a young person gets out in the world and is not on the same factor, right? So what does your village look like from a radical perspective for a young child?
So I think as we were discussing about the new village, right, in a digital era, I think I would recommend everybody who's interested in edtech and following this space to go through this framework, NDR framework put together by the central government. It's the National Digital Education Architecture, and what it proposes is it says that how do we come all together to create a omni-channel learning continuum for children, uh, and to some extent we have done this in the school space where children can access to our platform through any digital mean, both online and offline. So they can, let's say, access assessments on a chatbot running on WhatsApp. They can access content on a very personalized YouTube like app for them. They can access some courses put on the computer lab that they have in the school. And wherever they're using this, right, these platforms, they're using the same student ID to log in. And that student ID architecture allows us to create an interoperable learning continuum. So irrespective of where they are learning from, what access points do they have at school, out of school, in community, etc., etc. I mean, we are still able to ensure that learning continuum. And I think that, to me, should be the new village in the increasingly connected world.
All right. So I think there is, we are looking at, again, from your perspective, we are looking at tech playing a role and really it becoming democratizing information to some extent, instead of, it becoming the only way you connect to the world, right? And I think there is a lot of grassroots organizations are talking of that, right? Which is, how do you use technology to make information more accessible, right? So that's interesting. Manish, I'm going to move to you, but I'm going to ask this to you in a little different way, because I think by now we're very familiar with what reimagination really looks like for you. But what I'm going to ask you is this, that, Akash mentioned this when he was talking, which was the self meeting the system, right? And he spoke about this, that are we really looking at where does the self meet the system? And I think this is very true for young people today, right? I think they're living in a far more volatile world than probably we grew up in. They are living in a world which is constantly throwing at them fixes and is throwing at them systems that they need to fit in. So where should a young person, and therefore the ecosystem around her, look at meeting the system? Where is it that there is a scope of meeting the system, or are we at the point where we should just say that, take a break and go back, reimagine it, and let the learners reimagine it? So what does that look like? Where is the self going to meet the system at all?
I want to talk about village once, Megha. Come on.
No, I knew you were going to. I don't think I could have stopped you from doing that, but please, yeah.
So I think that, for me, having spent time in a lot of villages in India, the word village is very sacred. And it's one of my really trigger points when people start, in particularly global village advocates. But I don't know what kind of village, when we can have real village, if people don't want to become farmers, they don't want to grow food, they don't want to have control over their food systems anymore. They don't, or what kind of village we can have if we don't have commons and real community where people are sharing things with their heart and listening deeply. So, I mean, I think that I would just caution a lot of this, because it sounds like a lot of technology salesmanship to me and not real idea of people who have been, all of us, I grew up, I was denied village. All of us have not been given a village experience. We don't know, we only know what the textbook has fed us, but people who have lived in villages and experienced the joy and the beauty of it. Sure, there's shadows with everything, but for the most part, it is actually a really empowering experience. And I've seen village kids, if we gave a whole different kind of set of metrics, they would, we would see that I would claim that village kids and kids living in busties are far more intelligent than kids who go to Delhi public school or any of the elite schools of this country. So I think we need to look, and for me, the village, I would say 3 dimensions. So I totally disagree with what is said by the previous speakers. The first dimension of a healthy village and learning space has to be intergenerational relationships. And this idea that all kids being locked up in their own ages by themselves is the most stupid idea that humanity has created. That we need healthy relationships come when we have many generations spending time learning, doing things together. So I think that the whole redesign of our spaces has to be intergenerational. This idea of children's spaces or youth spaces or adult workspaces, we have to dismantle all of those ideas and say that let us create intergenerational healthy spaces. The second thing is, a dear friend of mine, Jinan, some of you know him, he says that in villages, children grow up seeing processes, real processes of how things are made. In cities and in schools, they see products only. So this idea, you know, where the things, how are things actually made? How do people fix things? How do people do things? That whole disconnection, what schooling has done is disconnected us fully, you know, from the production process of our daily life existence. And this kind of village is going to destroy the planet if we disconnect from these things, where children start thinking milk comes from a supermarket. You know, this kind of absurdity, which we've heard in the West, has crept into India already. So I think this idea of that processes of real production, where do my clothes come from? Where does my waste go? Where does my, you know, where does my food come from? These fundamental questions, schooling has disconnected us from all of these things. So I think we need to reclaim that. The third is our relationship to the natural world, to the land, to the soil, to the mountains, to the rivers. These are not commodities. School has conditioned us to believe these are commodities. There's a beautiful saying from Native Americans: what do people call your natural resources? We call our relatives. So this idea of that nature has to be central. We cannot pretend, you know, with climate change and everything else, we cannot continue to pretend that we are separate from nature. So schooling has produced this whole false narrative that nature is something out there and we're separate from it and superior and can continue to dominate it without any consequences. So I think some of these ideas we need to really think. And the fourth thing I would just add, I draw inspiration from the Amish community, that this techno-utopian salesmanship, a real village will always question what technologies do we really need. Gandhiji and Hind Swaraj is fundamentally raising this, that this thing, there's a beautiful saying from Ivan Illich: a tool or technology can very easily get out of your control and very quickly become your master and ultimately become your executioner. So this whole thing, a space of techno-utopian salesmanship, we need to start to question that fundamentally. Children need to be, these huge changes we're headed, you know, genetically modified human beings, bodies, food, everything, artificial intelligence, and there's no discussion around these in schools, no questioning of this. Huge surveillance systems are being set up in our country. People have no clue, and they're just playing around with these little technology things like they have no huge consequences for how society is being reorganized, how the human mind, what Rishikesh, is being reorganized by these technologies. So I think I would invite us to kind of go a bit deeper into how we talk about village if we're going to be using these words and not fall into the Western salesmanship, please. And yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that is something that
I got Rishikesh to smile finally.
No, I think all three of
Shashank
you
is not smiling though.
Niji, I am a practical person. I
am fully I've been practical for 25 years. Shashank, come and visit us. I'm not sitting in a university. I think we need to step out and create new models. That's the need of our times. Those models are there. I've been doing it for 25 years. I've worked with thousands of young people, Shashank. So I'm not talking some, theoretical BS. I'm actually talking real things on the ground. You can come and see it. And it's not only for urban rich kids. It's for tribal communities. I'm working with Basti children, those are the ones who are dears, because I think they're the only ones who can save India. These kids who are sitting in these elite schools are going to destroy our country. And so I think, I would invite you to open your imagination and come and see some of our work and all amazing projects around the country. So I just wanted to just say what Megha was saying, that we need to, the time has come for us to really stop trying to tinker with these existing systems. They are fundamentally, they're not actually broken. They're working super well to control and dominate and kill the human spirit. This is what Tagore and Gandhiji warned us about 100 years ago. People sitting in universities that do not understand that basic message, of what there was in Hind Swaraj. The whole idea of Swaraj is something very profound for us to explore. No schools and universities are taking it seriously. And I think we have started an alliance with Swaraj. So I am running, encouraging people, communities all over the country to start their own universities, their community, people's universities. Let's stop pretending these fake universities are going to solve anything. They're not geared to generate knowledge. They're geared to steal knowledge, and this is what most professors are trained to do, is to copyright other people's knowledge and not to create anything. There's no creation really happening in universities today. So let us go to the grassroots. Let's help communities set up their own ecoversities, what we call them. We have hundreds around the world which are already functioning, and really beautiful to see that, communities, I think the first thing we have to get out of on a policy level is this stupid terminology, first generation learners. This is the most ridiculous thing that has happened in our country, that we don't recognize people who are learning. For thousands of years, knowledge has been produced, learning without any universities, without any schools. And let us start to revalue what are those things, and then maybe we can build different systems. But it's already on, whether people like it or not, who are working in the system. There are thousands and thousands of people who are creating alternatives out of the system, and they're not going to wait for the government. They're not going to wait for any policymaker to do that. And and the young people, I think what I've given up on is the idea that thinking that these old people are going to do anything. Young people are creating their own systems and models. They're walking out of schools, they're walking out of universities, they're creating all kinds of amazing new possibilities. So we need to look at that and learn from those if we want to do something that's going to be meaningful for our country. Thank you.
So thanks, Manish. I think if we didn't plan on doing a poll in this session, but if there are just so many people who've been responding on the chat, one of the things that I think is emerging are all these new, I won't call them new, but really organizations or grassroots level people, individuals themselves are bringing back what was functioning earlier and really making it work, showing that it works. And if that is the reality, I wonder if it's about time that the system comes and meets the self. The system comes and acknowledges learners at the center of all of this, the individual, the person at the center of anything that the system is proposing. And maybe then there is a scope of these movements that are taking place across the country, getting acknowledged, becoming mainstay. Because one of the questions that I think we constantly asked, even at the work that we do at DeFi, is this, that what happens to the child who is growing up in this island of unsystem and unlearning space? What happens to her when she has to deal with the real world, right? And I wonder if this question itself is moot, because it kind of still continues to place the fact that the system is bigger than the self. And it's time that we shift that, and the more acknowledgement to the unlearning spaces, the unlearning conversations that is happening, if that takes place, then maybe at the policy level, it gets acknowledged as the mainstay, right? We're seeing that change with assessment systems. We're seeing that slowly change with the way they're looking at children, labeling children. But I wonder if there is now scope for collaboration, and this for me, I think is an invitation to everybody today who's attending this panel to come forward through the Quest Alliance, look at all these different systems that are already functioning across the country and are not necessarily seeking policy level acknowledgement or mandates, right? And are still working with tons and tons of children, young people, and are giving them meaningful purpose in life. So I think at this stage, this is a call out for collaboration, for more collaboration, because I think the more we learn from what are the different kinds of experiments taking place, what are the different kinds of systems that are emerging, that are led by the learner, that are being led by communities, I think then we are at a stage where we can ask this question again to ourselves, whether we're being played by the market or whether we're living a life that we want to live. At this stage, I know we have videos that are lined up from all our speakers towards as the closure to this. I do see that there were a lot of comments, a lot of questions. I've tried to really bring in your questions to the questions that I was asking. So I think they're not really questions, but if there's somebody at this point that really thinks they still have an unanswered question in their head, in the mind, please do type it in the chat box right now. If there are questions that you think I might have missed out, if there is any particular question that is still bothering you, that you still want to comment on, please do type it out in the chat box and I will take them on for sure. Before we wrap the panel, we will be wrapping up in about another 10 minutes. So we do have time. So please, anybody who thinks there is a question on their mind that they want to be typing out, please do that in the chat box right away. While you do that, we'll try and play out the videos, stack up the videos. So Quest team, if you can play out video from Manish to go with, that would be great, while we wait for questions on the chat box.
In recent times, there's one number that we all have become familiar with, and that is to do with access to the internet. In our country, only about 25% of the households have the access to internet. In cities like Delhi, it's a little over 50%, but in states like Orissa, it's just about 10%. But these figures are not the reason why I argue against digital technology being at the center of any reimagined education model. It is important that we do reimagine education delivery, particularly in these radically changing times where learning environments are also changing rapidly. But just by transplanting all that we have onto a digital platform will not give us the solutions. It will not do so because education is essentially a human process. We need to understand and appreciate what the aims of education are. It is only then that we will be able to reimagine education delivery in a meaningful way. Let us keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Quest team. At this point, before we play the next video, I will take two questions that have come up, and I think they would, it'll be very nice to get answers to them. One is this question on, this shift between what was earlier the guru model, and then it became teacher-led. It's called a lot of different names, but the teacher or the guru being at the center of teaching. So my question then becomes that, is that the only model of learning, or can we reimagine also who all do you learn from? Does a child only learn from an adult? And is that the only top-down model of learning available? And how will we reimagine the role of a teacher if also learning gets democratized and also learning itself becomes spread across generations? Then what will be the reimagined role of a teacher or a facilitator? And this I'll actually leave open to all three of you to take that question before I take on the next question.
Shall I go? Manish is taking time. Shashank is not really hinting at anything. Okay, see, children learn from all around them, right? They learn from the younger ones, they learn from their peers, they learn from the older ones. So there is learning happening all the time. Now, but I believe that there has to be a facilitator who will play the role of one who will create those scaffolding so that learning becomes meaningful, right? And so every now and then kind of lead the child or the children there towards a certain path. Because remember, I mean, there is at the end of the day, an aim of education for a society, right? I mean, it is based on the vision of the society, right? And for us in our country, I mean, what the vision that our constitution has for the kind of society that we would want, and that's the way towards which broadly we kind of facilitate our children's movement. So children are learning from anything and everything. So there is a facilitation that is required, and hence there is the importance of teacher. We should not ignore that. We cannot have a learning environment without a teacher. The problem is the way we've come to think of a teacher, and particularly from the images of the teachers that most of us have had in these factory schools, which is pretty much of one of a demon, right? In most cases, that's not a teacher, right? But then the teacher is very, very essential, and hence a lot of effort needs to go into thinking about what is it that needs to go in for preparing a teacher, what kind of teacher preparation, and what is it that the teachers require as support. Now, all these are very important policy matters. And that is why I believe that NEP 2020, in fact, is a very valuable document, because it does talk about teacher preparation. And that is very essential to for us to be able to ensure that there is this reimagined way of delivering education. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Shashank. Thanks for sharing that. Manish, do you want to go on this? What would be the reimagined role of a teacher?
Yes. So I think that there's a lot of discussion about the Gurukul going on there. And I think that unfortunately we are conditioned to see the Gurukul and understand it through the lens of factory schooling. That's our own conditioning. So every time we look and talk about it, we think the Guru is at the center. But I think that for me, one of the most important proverbs I've heard is the best Guru never teaches you anything. And so I think that we need to understand this very profound wisdom. And we have the story of Eklavya, which is, sadly, again, some people in this call are seeing, and most of the people working in the education field see Eklavya as a victim. But Eklavya's story is not a victim. Eklavya's story is of a hero. He is the first documented self-designed learner. He shows that you don't need to, we need to decenter the entire process. And even if we design models based on self-designed learning, excellence is even possible. Not only excellence, but deep humility and deep respect and love is possible, and so I think the tragedy is we don't even understand our own stories that we say and repeat. And this is the part of the colonialist mindset, is that we have not been able to really decode and decipher these stories properly. They've been manipulated for institutions. I think the point is that I would not spend a single penny on teacher training. I think it's pouring money down the toilet. It's equivalent to doing that. I think there's no example anywhere in the world where teacher training has actually really worked to radically change the education system. And I think that, if you want to do anything, then you need to fundamentally shift the whole selection process of teachers, the whole idea. It's not, and most of the teachers I've met in my own life actually don't even like children. This is the pathetic tragedy of it. And you're expecting them to, that's something that you cannot do any training around. If they, either people really love children and love being around them, or they don't. And most of the people who end up in schools don't like children. They're really, unfortunately, even nasty towards children. And so I think, you can try to train them all you want. You're not going to change anything there. They don't know how to listen to children. Again, so this is not, this is something much more profound. And I think that, we need to move out of this teacher-centered program. Most of what we learn actually is not, if I reflect on my own life, it wasn't from my teachers. It was from my friends and from the situations, the challenges I faced in my life. And so that's unfortunately, we're not, we're just reparroting all of these things we've read or heard. We don't reflect on actually how real learning happens for kids. And if we do that, then we could move out of this. And this, idea of a guru and a teacher is so fundamentally different, these things, that we need to understand that. The guru can never, in our tradition, if I tell Rishikesh tomorrow, I'm your guru, touch my feet, Rishikesh will start laughing like crazy. And so will Shashank, because they know that a guru can never be imposed. There's no compulsion in the Guru Shishya Parampara. It's mutual agreements and things. And so if we want to really move towards a real guru system, the first thing, again, with the self-designed learning, is that the real process, any real democracy also doesn't start with choosing your, we say it doesn't start with choosing your rulers. It starts when we have the power again to choose our own gurus. And then unless we fundamentally shift this from this compulsive state-imposed people who don't even don't know anything real or practical, who are teaching, who don't want to even be teaching, forcing them on our children, I think that this is a disaster, and it's never going to work. And there's no example of it anywhere in the world where it has worked. I would challenge anybody to come up with those examples where teacher training has radically shifted education systems.
Thanks, Manish. I know we have exactly 2 minutes to wrap up the panel. So, I'm going to take on that one question, and how far away are we from radical? I think I can respond to that and say that we're as close to radical reimagination as we choose to be. And I think we've seen that in some countries across the globe. My favorite example, and that I keep talking about in this education sector, is Finland. And I would encourage you to read about it. The community in Finland, the government one day, took a public consultation and got up and gave out just a notification that it was going to reimagine its education system from scratch. And it spent the next 2 years just sitting down with all parts of the ecosystem to reimagine what its education was going to look like. And so I would really say that we're as close to radical as we think we are ready for it. Because no shift, no change is ever going to happen because somebody at the government higher up suddenly woke up with an epiphany and did it for us. So I think our radical is as close to as we think we want it. And I therefore do encourage all of you to collaborate, to look at the radical that's happening within the country. Whether it is the work that Shikshantar is doing, whether it is the last mile connectivity that Convergenius is trying to really build for marginalized communities, the work that policy level is happening. I think the more we're talking to each other, the more we're collaborating, the more questions we are asking with each other, the more closer we are to radically reimagining it. So that was my response to how far are we from radical. I can say that for us at Project Defy, I heard this from a very intelligent man who said that education did not exist 400 years ago. Schools did not exist 400 years ago. They won't exist 400 years from now. And it's one of my favorite quotes in terms of what is radical and how close are we to it. So with that, I know we are at the close of the panel. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all three of you. Some really crazy conversations. I think some really radical opinions that we got here. But I will want to close this panel with encouraging everyone, with a request, with an invitation to all of you to reach out, to learn about what are the radical movements that are already taking place in this country. And maybe then we can reach a point of saying that these now need acknowledgement and these now need mandates that have to be passed out in policy. So on that note, thank you so much.